The theological background and foundation of Islam. As you study the origins of Islam, its theological background and foundation is absolutely essential to gaining an understanding of its beliefs and emphases. In particular, we're going to look at its distorted biblical roots as well as its incorporation of pagan beliefs and practices. When one sees these elements, therefore, one can in no way say the God of Islam is the same as the Judeo-Christian God. It is absolutely impossible. It'd be like trying to say that Ronald Reagan was a communist. I mean, that's about how nonsensical that would be. Okay? We'll first take a look at the Kaaba. Some people spell it K-A-A-B-A and so forth, but it's like Quran and Quran. It's the same difference. It's how you pronounce the vowels and such, which is located in Mecca. This is the most sacred place for Islam, for it is from here that the Muslims draw their spiritual foundation for their existence and belief. I mean, this is core to everything they do. Next to the revelations, these revelations that Muhammad supposedly received, the Kaaba is the central place for them. The descendants of Ishmael embraced the culture and beliefs of the Hamitic line, and they became idolaters, polytheists, and animists, which included involvement in occult and demonic activity. One major result of this idolatrous and occultic belief and practice is that the Kaaba and Mecca became a central focus of this demonic and occultic activity. The Kaaba itself is a huge black meteorite that the Arabs saw as a sacred object as far back as can be recalled. In other words, there is no particular date here. It wasn't here and now it's here. I mean, there's no such time. It's just as far back as can be remembered. A central feature of the Kaaba in pre-Islamic Arabia was that Kaaba was a central place where the moon god Hubal was worshipped. And Hubal is considered to be the precursor to Allah. Very significant. What is quite certain is that the pagan Arabs in Mecca worshipped a moon god called Hubal at the Kaaba. Hubal was the lord of the Kaaba, being the highest ranking god of the 360 gods worshipped in the Kaaba. They had one for every day. Now here's the amazing thing. Allah was also worshipped as the Lord of the Kaaba. So this idea of Allah being some new thing all of a sudden, no, He's been there for a very, very long time. Yet Allah was never represented by any idol of physical nature. To suggest the polytheistic Arabs never created an idol to represent Allah is simply unreasonable and unbelievable. We suggest rather that Hubal was who the pagan Arabs addressed their prayers to Allah through. In other words, Hubal was the picture of who they were praying to Allah. He was like the mediator, the so forth, okay? Hubal was who the pagan gods addressed their prayers to Allah through. In other words, Allah was Hubal. Muhammad came along and smashed the idol of Hubal, and now the Arabs had no idol of Allah to pray through anymore, and Hubal was forgotten. Are you with me? So basically, Hubal and Allah were the one and the same. Hubal was the statue through which they prayed to reach Allah. Then he destroyed it. But they are one and the same. All right? There are stories in the Sirah of pagan Meccans praying to Allah while standing beside the image of Hubal, and there's the source. Thus, we can clearly see that the origin of Allah antedates the revelations received by Muhammad. And the basic belief system of Islam is nothing less than sheer unadulterated paganism that has been cleaned up a bit, but nonetheless is sophisticated paganism. And that's my perspective. It is clearly sophisticated paganism. And we'll see when we get into some of the sexual things. We've already alluded to that. And Rocky's going to share a little bit about some stuff that he's experienced later on this morning. Another very important aspect of the development of the worship of Allah is the origin of the name. The Kaaba was dedicated to Allah, the high God of the pagan Arabs, despite the presiding effigy of Hubal, in other words, his statue that was there. By the beginning of the 7th century, that's the 7th century AD, Allah had become more important than before in the religious life of many of the Arabs. Now, al is a preposition, and it's a Semitic preposition in most all of your Semitic languages. It means upon or above or up, okay? Upon something, up something. Allah was the name for God, so it's calling about the high God who is above. That's what that's saying. Many primitive religions develop a belief in a high God who is sometimes called the sky god. We saw this in ancient Sumeria, they had that. But they also carried on worshiping the other gods who remained deeply important to them. So this idea of Allah was one of the many gods. He was the high God, the supreme God, but he was nonetheless one of the many, all right? Next. As we have seen, Muhammad was born in 570 AD, at the end of the 6th century AD, and he received his revelations in 610 AD, at the beginning of the 7th century AD, which is the very time period and cultural setting Armstrong is describing. That is the author we just quoted. So at this time frame, we begin to see the ascendancy of Allah over these other gods there that the pagan Arabs worshipped, right? Another very interesting aspect of the origin of Allah is the name itself. According to Bob Trubshaw in his article entitled "The Black Stone, the Omphalos of the Goddess," the name Allah appears to have had at least a feminine connection, if not a feminine origin. Now this is fascinating when you consider that Islam is one of the most sexist and male chauvinist religions in the entire world still today, okay? The woman is considered basically property. And ladies, you think you may have a hard time with your husband now. If you were over there, you'd get the snot beat out of you and nobody would say a thing. He can hit you and beat you. I mean, I just can't even conceive of that, but that's the way they do it. Please, please, if you get the chance, get the movie Not Without My Daughter. Not Without My Daughter. It was a TV movie. Sally Field stars. How many of you remember seeing that? Oh, most of you, okay. Great movie. It is a true, accurate picture. All right. Pre-Islamic worship of the goddess seems to be primarily associated with Allat, which simply means goddess. She is a triple goddess, similar to the Greek lunar deity Cora, Demeter, and Hecate. Each aspect of this trinity, now this is what's fascinating. Remember I mentioned the other day that in ancient Egyptian literature and theological belief, they had a trinity. Satan always, not sometimes, not occasionally, always has his alternative. Remember when Moses went before Pharaoh and his magicians copied until the gnats, and they couldn't copy that, and they looked at this and they told Pharaoh, they said, son, you better, not son, they said, sir, you better realize that this is the true finger of God because we can't duplicate this. But Satan always has his copy, okay, always in everything he does. Understand that. That's why it's called the Antichrist, all right? Each aspect of this Trinity corresponds to a phase of the moon. In the same way, Allat has three names known to the initiate. Ore, the crescent moon, or the maiden. What do you see on Islamic flags? Fascinating. Why do you think you see that? Because of Hubal. Okay? Al-Uzza, literally the strong one, who is the full moon and the mother aspect. Then Al-Manat, the waning but wise goddess of fate, prophecy, and divination. Divination has to do a lot with their metaphysical, their mystical stuff. Islamic tradition continues to recognize these three, but labels them daughters of Allah. Is that incredible or what? In addition, Trubshaw also points out how the Arabs worshipped these goddesses. According to Edward Rice, Al-Uzza was especially worshipped at the Kaaba, where she was served by 7 priestesses. Now listen to this. Her worshipers circle the holy stone 7 times. Once for each of the ancient 7 planets. And they did so buck naked, totally in nudity. Near the Kaaba is the ever-flowing well, Zamzam, which cools the throats of the countless millions of pilgrims. So in other words, this going around the Kaaba 7 times is not something that initiated with Muhammad. Okay? This was something that had been going on for eons, centuries before. A pagan worship practices. Now it's certainly cleaned up. Trubshaw then goes on to point out how this ancient pagan practice of the goddess worship is carried over into modern day Islam. When Muhammad wanted to supplant Al-Lut with Allah, this was the one temple he must conquer. He had to conquer that, okay? He had to overcome it. Although Muhammad did conquer the Kaaba, little else changed. The faithful still circle the Holy of Holies 7 times, although I hasten to add now fully clothed. The priests of the sacred shrine are still known as Beni. The word for Ben is the Semitic word for sons in Hebrew and Aramaic, Ugaritic, everything. Shabbat, or son of the old woman. Shabbat being, of course, the famous Queen of Sheba of Solomon's time. So what they're saying is that she ultimately bore these sons by Solomon, and these are the 7 sons of the old woman, all the way back to ancient pagan times. Very, very important to understand and grasp and see. Okay? And all, again, the sexual connotation of all of this. You see that? It permeates, it permeates, it permeates. Now, Rocky, you saw a lot of stuff over there. You're not going to tell about all that, I know, but you saw a lot of this, did you not? Yeah. And the sexual perversion permeates every aspect of the religion. Now, we have sexual perversion all over our culture, don't we, here? But it's not something we embrace and condone and sanction, is it? But it goes on. But with Islam, it is. It is embraced, and we'll look in some things this afternoon a little bit as we get into the scripture stuff. Thus, we can see that not only the Kaaba, but the very essence, origin, and belief in the name of Allah has deep and penetrating pagan and occultic roots. A man named Ibn Warraq, a former Muslim, also writes of Hubal in relation to the Kaaba in his book, Why I Am Not a Muslim. Hubal was worshipped at Mecca, and his idol in red cornelian was erected inside the Kaaba above the dry well into which one threw votive offerings. It is very probable that Hubal had a human form. Hubal's position next to the black stone suggests there is some connection between the two. Now, Wellhausen thinks that Hubal originally was the black stone. In other words, before they built the statue, the black stone was considered to be Hubal. Okay? That, as we have already remarked, is more ancient than the idol. So the stone was there, and they just called that, and ultimately they built an idol to represent who they thought he was. Wellhausen also points out that God is called the Lord of the Kaaba and the Lord of the territory of Mecca in the Quran. The prophet railed against the homage rendered at the Kaaba to the goddess Al-Lat, Manat, and Al-Uzza, whom the pagan Arabs call the daughters of God. But Muhammad stopped short of attacking the cult of Hubal. So in other words, you can see his attack on the daughters of Allah. The idea that women are totally beneath men. This feminine connection was something that he was doing everything he could to denigrate and to do away with, all right? From this, Wellhausen concludes that Hubal is no other than Allah, the God of the Meccans. When the Meccans defeated the prophet near Medina, their leader is said to have shouted, Hurrah for Hubal. So the connection here is unquestionable. And as we said, Wellhausen and others really believe that Hubal is Allah. That's who he was. He basically became it when he destroyed when Muhammad ultimately destroyed the statue. The statue was destroyed, but they were still worshiping the very same God of Hubal. They just named him now Allah, the high God. Are you with me? He just was the high God, but he was the very same person, the same characteristics, everything that Hubal, the moon god, was. All right? Warwick goes on to describe the prevailing Muslim view of the Kaaba. According to Muslim writers, the Kaaba was first built in heaven, where a model of it still remains. Now, I want you to understand, now this guy he's talking about, he's obviously a Muslim. He comes from somebody that's not a Jew, and he's not a real fan of Jews. But he's dealing with it. So, what do we have in the Bible that's described in heaven right now? Jerusalem. Are you with me? Everything in Islam is the antithesis of biblical truth. Everything. Not some things, not a few things. Everything. You have to understand that. This is one of the most skilled, crafted, satanic deceptions that Islam is that I know of. Built in heaven, where a model of it still remains 2,000 years before the creation of the world. All right? So here was this Kaaba up there. Adam erected the Kaaba on earth, but this was destroyed during the flood. Abraham was instructed to rebuild it. Abraham was assisted by Ishmael. While looking for a stone to mark the corner of the building, Ishmael met the angel Gabriel. Of course, Gabriel came and spoke supposedly to Muhammad, who gave him the black stone. That is the big stone. The Kaaba, remember, is built around it. Okay, it's the temple around it, which was then whiter than milk. So the stone initially was white, just pure white. It was only later that it became black from the sins of those who touched it. The above is, of course, an adaptation of the Jewish legend, account of the heavenly and earthly Jerusalem. So in other words, he says it's legend, but we know the truth of it. But he's a Muslim who basically rejected Islam. But he's pointing out some very significant truths here. And what was so significant to me is the antithesis. I mean, the absolute correlation of everything that's in the Bible. They have an opposite perspective of that, okay, for themselves. Warwick then presents a stinging critique of the Muslim view. And these are different writers. While Muir, these Old Testament scholars, while Muir and Torrey are convinced that the Abrahamic origin of the Kaaba was a popular belief long before the time of Muhammad, Snoek Hurgaj is a Danish scholar, and Alois Springer agree that the association of Abraham with the Kaaba, personally, should be personally, I'm sorry, was Muhammad's invention. Okay? So in other words, these other scholars think this was something that, went long before the time of Muhammad. And I tend to think that concept was already there. But Muhammad comes along and really, he thinks, these other three writers think that he invented it. I don't think that he necessarily invented it, but I do think he intensified it. Are you with me? This was legend, this was story. But Muhammad comes along and basically, if you will, codifies this thing. Okay? You can have traditions that people, belong. All of a sudden somebody comes along like an Adolf Hitler and brings together all of the German legends, all of the folklore to boom, to where you have the Übermann, the Superman. Who is who? Who is the Superman for the Germans? Well, no, but I mean, but what kind of man? Aryan, the Aryan man. Are you with me? So all of these legends, these concepts, all this come together. Hitler basically takes them and puts them together with the music of Richard Wagner, the writings of Nietzsche, and he creates this Übermann, the Superman, all right? That's what I think that's what I think Muhammad did. That's just my own personal opinion. Because you can read, this other stuff was there. There was a clear that connection and so forth. And all of these concepts and ideas, but they were real loose. Are you with me? Because they had all the tribes, they were all fighting, but as we saw, Muhammad came and united the Arab peoples with the glue of Islam, and we're going to see the ultimate thing is the superiority of Islamic heritage and belief in the Arab person over against the Judeo-Christian thing, belief system. Very fascinating. All right. And it served as a means to liberate, now this is the key, Islam from Judaism. This is the key thing. Because it not only liberated, but it gave them a sense of superiority. This goes all the way back to Ishmael being cast out, Ishmael not being the child of the promise, what Paul writes in Galatians 4, 21 through 31. Are you with me? Folks, this is all tied together. This is not woo-woo stuff. This is truth. This is historical, psychological, anthropological, and sociological truth. This is what these people live with. Why do you think they hate the Jews so? And it's an obsessive hatred. It's because they remind them that they're second. The sense of inferiority, the sense that we want to prove ourselves. I mean, it's just intense. It's incredible. And that's all tied in. That's what you've got to understand when you're dealing with the Arab people. All right. Springer's conclusion is harsh. By this lie, and I agree with what Springer's saying, Muhammad gave to Islam all that man needs and which differentiates religion from philosophy. A nationality, ceremonies, historical memories, mysteries, and assurance of entering heaven, all the while deceiving his own conscience and those of others. That is an absolute statement of truth. Now, he was just an ignorant guy, but Satan used this man clearly, inextricably, to do these very things. That's what you're dealing with today with Islam. The hatred of the Jews, the hatred of the Christians. They hate the Jews the worst because they were brothers. And Isaac was the son of the promise. It's very clear all the way through. It's absolutely undeniable. Thus, Islam has its origin in pagan occultic beliefs and practices that were carried over by Muhammad into present-day Islamic belief and practice. Before we get into this next aspect here, let's just stand here. We'll take a quick little break, and then Rocky, I want you to come up and share a little bit about what you saw, and then we're going to get into the Quran itself and the amalgamation of all these other beliefs. So let's just stand and just take a quick little break.